So now that we've got our edge nodes and our edge clusters set up, let's put something on them. That's what this is all about, is building out our tier 0 and our tier 1 gateways so that we can actually have routing services in NSX natively. Now, what are we going on about here? Well, we're going to talk about our tier 1 gateways and how we configure those. We're going to talk about our tier 0 gateways and how we configure those and how to make sure that connectivity is there. Now, when we configure our gateways, we can look at this a couple of different ways. We prescribe here on the on this slide, we kind of prescribe a bottom-up approach for configuration where we build out the segments and then we build out our tier 1 gateways and then we set up our tier 0 gateway and interconnect the tier 0 and tier 1 gateways and then get all of our routing set up for our tier 0 gateway north. Now, that works just fine, but maybe you already have something in mind that you want to build. Well, we could do this the opposite way, where we build out our tier 0 gateways and get those all set up and get routing all configured up, and then we start building the tier 1 gateways underneath that, and then we build the segments and attach the segments to the tier 1 gateways. Either way works, but all of these things will have to be done at some point in order for north-south routing ultimately to be useful. Now, the tier 1 gateway, if we follow the bottom-up approach, we've already built our segments. We did that a few labs ago. If we build up our segments, we can then create our tier 1 gateway. So in the NSX UI here, we're going to go back to the networking tab and go over to tier 1 gateways over in the navigation menu on the left. And there's just a big button there that says add a tier 1 gateway. Well, that's great. We can add that tier 1 gateway and we get a simple dialog here that we can look at, that we can work with. We can give the gateway a name. Every object in NSX has to have a human readable name. We can choose the HA mode. All right, we've got a few different options there. We've got a distributed only option, which means there are not going to be any service routers. There's an active standby where we're going to then need to select an edge cluster to put that active and standby service router on. And then there's an active mode that's available. We'll talk about the stateful active stuff quite a bit later. Actually, that's gonna come in later when we talk about services. But we've got these different HA modes that we can select, and then we're done. That's all we need to do to build a gateway. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. Now, when we go to connect our segments to our gateways, we have to go and edit the segment. Now, if you remember, when we built the segment, there was a connectivity dropdown that we left in the lab, at least. We left at none, right, the default value. We did plug in a subnet value, which defines the gateway IP address that we need a tier 1 gateway for, or some gateway for at least, and could be a tier 0. But what we need to do is go in and edit those segments and choose the connectivity option, right? What gateway do we want to attach to? And we'll get a drop-down menu that simply lists out all of the gateways in our environment. If we haven't set one, we'll have to set a gateway IP address to configure on that router interface. And then we just save what we've just edited. We save the new configuration for the segment, and now our segment is actually attached to our tier 1 gateway. Now we can validate that if we go back to our network topology. We can validate and look and see that web segment and here app segment and DB segment are all connected to a tier 1 gateway called T1-GW-01. And we can look at that and see that now we should have connectivity from our web servers to our app servers, from our web servers to the database servers, and so on. And we can test that, right? We can test that by getting into the virtual machines and maybe doing a simple ping from web to app or app to DB or DB back to web or something like that, right? We can validate that this routing all works. Now, that's the tier 1 gateway. The tier 1 gateway is really, really, really simple. The tier 0 gateway, there's a little bit more complexity to building this, but only a little bit. And we have a little bit more complexity because we have to build these uplink segments. So the uplink segments are what the interfaces, the uplink interfaces will actually attach to. And so we're going to build these segments, and they're going to be VLAN segments. and we'll assign the VLAN tag to these segments for our transit network, whatever transit network that might be, right? So we need to build these in our segments UI, just like we built our web and our app segments and so on. The big difference is we're going to assign these segments to a VLAN transport zone, and that VLAN transport zone has to be configured on the edge gateway. And then we can go in and start building the tier 1 gate, or not the tier 1, I'm sorry, the tier 0 gateway. We can go into the tier 0 gateways UI and hit the button. Now, the button's not a button itself. It's a drop-down menu where we can select either a tier 1 gateway or a VRF. We'll talk about VRFs in a future video. Here, we're just looking at a tier 0 gateway. So we'll select a tier 0 gateway from the drop-down, and we'll be presented with the menu here that says what's the name you want to give the gateway, what HA mode do you want, active or active standby, do you want to enable stateful active. Again, we'll talk about that later, and what edge cluster does this gateway need to consume, right? So where are we going to put these uplink interfaces when we start configuring them? Once we save that, we're going to get a pop-up that says, do you want to continue configuring? And we want to say yes to that pop-up, because now we're going to go in and build our interfaces, right? We can't build the interfaces as we're building the gateway object. We have to add those interfaces to an existing gateway object. That's why we have that pop-up and why we want to continue configuring. And what we do is we find the interfaces header in the gateway configuration. We expand that out and we click the set button, and that pops up the set interfaces dialog where we can add interfaces. We want to add as many interfaces as is appropriate for our configuration, and we'll go ahead and add those, and each interface is going to be associated with an edge transport node. So when I build the interface, when I configure the interface, I specify an edge transport node on which this is going to live. I also specify the segment to which I want to attach the uplink interface. And that's going to ultimately trigger the service router creation for a tier 0 gateway, right? So if I put an interface on SA NSX01, NSX Edge 01, that will trigger NSX to create the service router object on SA NSX Edge 01. If I create another interface and put that on NSX Edge 02, that'll trigger another service router component to be created on SA NSX Edge 02. So I will build as many interfaces, as many uplink interfaces as is necessary for my deployment, and I can go ahead and close this configuration dialog. Once that's done, I'll have to configure routing. Now, we'll talk about routing specifically in the next video. Here, all we're saying is I have to configure routing, whether it's static routing or dynamic routing through BGP or OSPF. And this is all found right in the tier 0 gateway configuration dialog. Once I do that, I have to edit my tier 1 gateway and attach the tier 1 gateway, link the tier 1 gateway to the tier 0 gateway. That's going to create that router link interface that we talked about and set everything up that goes there. We're not done yet. There's still more stuff we have to do. We have to go into the tier 1 gateway at this point, and we have to edit what we call route advertisement. Now, route advertisement is just defining what types of subnets we want to tell the tier 0 gateway about from the tier 1 gateway. So do we want to tell the tier 0 gateway about our connected segments? Do we want to tell the tier 0 gateway about our NAT IP addresses? Do we want to tell the tier 0 gateway about our VPN endpoints? Things like that, right? What things do we want to what route configurations do we want to push from the tier 0 gateway up to the tier 1 gateway? That's our route advertisement. And then from the tier 0 gateway, we have to define our route redistribution rules. And so the route redistribution rules tell the tier 0 gateway what prefixes we want to redistribute into our routing protocol. In other words, do we want to tell BGP about those tier 1 connected segments? Or do we want to tell BGP about the tier 0 connected segments, or the tier 0 or tier 1 VPN endpoints, or so on and so forth? So route advertisement is configuring what we're going to tell the tier 0 gateway about the tier 1 gateways. And then route redistribution is what we're going to tell the tier 0 gateways to redistribute into our routing protocol so that the physical network knows about those prefixes and how to get there. Again, once we have this stuff configured, we can look in the routing topology, or the network topology rather, in the networking UI, and we can now see that our segments are attached to a tier 1 gateway, and the tier 1 gateway in turn is attached to a tier 0 gateway. Now, with our tier 0 gateways, another feature of our network topology really comes to shine, and that's the fabric view, where we can actually see the different service router components. We can see the edge nodes on which those service router components are attached. We can see the uplink interfaces on those different components and so on. So we can visualize all of the stuff we're building here in NSX. Once we've got our connectivity set, we want to test that, right? We want to make sure that we've got things set the way we expect them to be set. And so what we can do to validate that is simply to try and say ping from a workload inside of NSX to a workload outside of NSX and vice versa. If that works, we know we've got it right. And so here we're going to go into just a single lab. We're going to configure a tier 1 gateway. We're not going to get to a tier 0 gateway quite yet. That's going to come in the next couple of labs. We'll get there. Hang tight. Here in this lab, we're going to build out a tier 1 gateway and connect our 3 segments, web app and DB. We're going to connect those segments to that gateway. We're going to then make sure our route advertisement is set properly and all of that kind of stuff. And we're going to go ahead and test that connectivity from web to app, from web to DB, from app to DB, and so on. So go build your tier 1 gateway. Come back. We'll wrap this lesson up. All right, so now we've got a tier 1 gateway. Everything should be working. Our web servers and our app servers and our database servers should all be able to communicate with each other. Everything should be good there. So we talked about tier 0 and tier 1 gateways and the mechanics of how to build those things. When we come back in the next video, we'll talk about routing and static routing and BGP and OSPF and how to set those up. And after that, we'll get into building the tier 0 gateway. So come back and check us out for the next video. We'll see you there.